Hi, welcome to More Christ. I'm Marcus. Today I'm delighted to be joined by George Harrell. George is a humanities teacher with Kepler Education, a consortium of independent teachers online bringing classical Christian education to junior high and high school students based in the States, but open to others. He's also the director of the George Buchanan Forum, a community of liberty-minded Christians seeking to integrate theology, natural law, and history. So just to begin, George, can you tell me a little bit about your background and some of the key figures who've helped you become the man that you are now, whether that be someone like George Buchanan, who the forum's named after, my friend Jared Casey, who I know you've spoken highly of, or even someone closer to home?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's really great to talk with you, and I really appreciate the work that you've been doing with your platform and your podcast. So, yeah, I'm really excited to be able to talk about these topics with you. And as far as I'm concerned, yeah, I'm a educator with Kepler Education, and yes, it is based in the United States, but it's online. So I've had Canadian students, Australian students, outside of the United States, and that's a great fun opportunity to be able to discuss at a more international level a lot of these topics. And my background is in liberal arts and humanities, and so that's something that I've always had a great passion and enjoyment for, and something that I had always wanted to be able to talk and teach on these subjects. And thanks to things like Kepler Education and George Buchanan Forum, that's something that I've had a great opportunity to be able to explore these with people. And you'd asked about people that had been influences upon me, and I feel like that's kind of always worry that you're going to have one of the moments at an award ceremony where you're trying to name off all the people that have influenced you, and you forget to mention your mother and God in the course of that. and uh, and it's like, obviously there's so many people that you could point to, and uh, if I was to think just kind of very broadly at some level, people that have had a perhaps an outsized influence on kind of some of these topics that I like to discuss and work on. People like Lewis and Tolkien obviously have been massively influential for me throughout my childhood, and going on and appreciating them as an adult in ways that I wasn't even able to as a kid. Their works both within literature and academically, and how we then academically think about literature, has been just absolutely profound. And I can't emphasize them enough. Other people would be, as people like Peter Lightheart had influenced me greatly in just thinking about scripture narratively, and understanding theology from a narrative framework. Um, Martin Shaw was a huge influence on me, and also people like Paul Kingsnorth. I love the work that he's done, and also individuals like Jordan Peterson. And man, yeah, there's just a whole host of other people. There's a list that you could go on and on. But those would be some individuals that have definitely helped frame a lot of the questions and narratives that around these topics for me.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thanks, George. And before we started recording, I was asking you a little bit about your work with Kepler, which I think is doing an amazing job. But I want to know a bit more about how you got involved with classical education and what it means to you fundamentally, because you're given an impassioned kind of a bit about classical education and the dangers of much modern schooling before we started recording, and I thought that would be a shame if we didn't get to share that with people.
Yeah. So I always wanted to go on and get involved in education, and Kepler has been a really exciting platform for me to be able to pursue that, in part because one of the things that it does is it doesn't uh, attempt to be a an imitation of the modern education system that we have broadly across the West. And it's geared towards homeschoolers and people who are saying, okay, either I would like to substitute a course here? I don't feel comfortable teaching something like calculus. Can I get someone else to help do that? So there's freedom for the students. There's also a more home-based study system where the students are studying through the course of the week and then meeting and recitations with teachers and fellow students live, and being able to actively engage and participate in the discussions around these topics. And that's a really great opportunity to be able to dig into the material, but without also taking the students away from their home life. And then there's also a diploma course which students can then follow through high school if they actually want to follow the Kepler platform all the way through and be able to graduate high school solely relying on Kepler. But then at the same time, for the teachers, there's a certain freedom that we have in being able to propose courses, because I'm not actually a employee of Kepler. It's a platform, so we're able to propose topics, say, hey, this is something that I'm interested in teaching. Is there interest among the student body out there? Would other people like to take these courses? And there's a freedom that they allow the teachers then to be able to bring their own unique voice to these topics. And that's something that I've really enjoyed being able to explore.
That's brilliant. Thanks, George. And then another facet of your work is the George Buchanan Forum. I wonder what inspired it and what do you hope will come from it ultimately then?
Yes, yeah. The George Buchanan Forum is something that was brought about several years ago, kind of during, I think it was during COVID. So it's been around for a couple of years now. It was started by a friend, Jeremy Bunch. He's the president of the George Buchanan Forum, and I'm the executive director, which just means basically that I herd sheep and try to make things happen. And
Yeah.
the idea behind that, I'd mentioned to you earlier that I live in northern Idaho. This is the heart of Christian nationalist country, and a fun tie-in between where I am geographically and where you are in Northern Ireland. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Crawford Gribben.
Mhm.
Okay, I don't know. Have you read his Survival and Resistance in Evangelical America?
I've not read that one.
Okay, so yeah, you have a Northern Irish historian whose background is actually in the Puritans. And
Mhm.
he's writing this work on what's going on in the inland northwest of the United States, both theologically and sociologically. And he has kind of a unique perspective that he's able to bring to it as somebody who had studied the Puritans. And it's quite an interesting cocktail geographically here of theology and politics and economics. So that never it's never shy or short mm, on exciting topics to explore, shall we say. And there's so one of the things that we were wanting to do with the George Buchanan Forum was be able to speak to the issues here in some ways very similarly to Paul Vanderklay's discussions around colonizing the internet. And
Mhm.
like, how can we actually use the internet and use things like YouTube and podcasting to actually be able to affect change with real people and real relationships that we have? So one of the things that we wanted to do was to be able to speak to our actual current location and the issues and problems that we see here, like I said, the topics and conversations that people are having within this particular geographical region, either to be able to say, hey, the conversations that people are having around a given topic, we don't think that this binary discussion is particularly helpful. Maybe it's forgetting or missing a particular approach that would actually help to inform the topic, or say, hey, there are conversations that we are not having that we ought to be having. So could we create a platform that actually brings people in the region that we are located in to meet live, meet in an actual room, have these conversations, have people present and bring up topics for discussion, push the Overton window, push the way people are thinking, perhaps outside of their 3x5 card of allowable opinion, get them to think outside of the box that they are in and say, hey, let's expand this conversation. Let's try to push this way or that way. And then through that, be able to also provide this material, because not everybody can meet actually at a live event such as this, but say, hey, I know you. Here's a talk given by someone like Jonathan McIntosh, who's spoken extensively at the George Buchanan Forum. I think this would help on the conversations that you're having with your friends and help move the Overton window within our particular area towards conversations, like I said, that I think we're missing or lacking, and that we would like to have also a kind of a resume of these conversations, that we don't always have to keep repeating and like treading the same ground over and over again. And like I said earlier, being able to push the conversation, hopefully in a more thoughtful direction. So that was the idea behind the George Buchanan Forum. And the idea there was also to cultivate a more humane understanding around the topics related to theology, history, and natural law, or you could even think of it sort of as like the conversation between the divine, the empirical, and the deductive, and say, how can we actually approach these things as human beings holistically and in a way that better reflects the creator whose image we're made in, so that these conversations are not as stunted as they often appear in social media. So that's
No,
kind of the goal, the overall goal for that.
yeah, no, that's great, George. And another element to your work that I appreciate is how you incorporate things like economics, and even beyond that, the more fundamental issue of this Thomas Sowell talks about, there are no solutions, only trade-offs and so on. It seems to resonate with human nature and our nature as sinful creatures and so on. I wonder if you might speak to that and why the study of things like economics is vital for Christians, and who are some models that you think we should or could be emulate in that respect then?
Yeah, what a great quote. And yeah, I perhaps overuse that one. So I enjoy hearing it coming from somebody else this time. Yeah. The question of economics is so important, and it's one of the topics that I have taught with Kepler. And one of the things trying to push back against with how we generally understand economics, it usually focuses on providing graphs and charts in an attempt to demonstrate how financial resources move around within an economy. And they do this usually at the expense of understanding the human element that's involved in coordinating the process of production. And the reason why this is a problem is because humans are unpredictable, and they're unique in the natural world, and that they're possessing reason, passions, desires, goals, and this makes them unfit for the usual predictive models and methods of the natural sciences. But because the natural sciences have been so successful, and they've led to the proliferation of empiricism into the social sciences, where it shouldn't be applied as the chief and foremost method of observation and explanation, because it's missing the fact that human beings have free will. And so this is most particularly relevant in the study of economics. And the current mainstream economic model that's taken hold in the 30s and the 40s as Keynesianism has taken root, that demands that management, government, and political management take center stage of how we utilize economics, socially speaking. And so one of the problems that, perhaps the biggest problem that emerges from this is that the government officials who are then tasked with implementing economic policies are then assumed to be both benevolent and to also possess omniscience. Those are kind of the two key requirements to be able to implement these economic policies. And this has allowed the governments to be employed as a corrective then to perceived failures, without realizing that so often they are actually the cause of the problems that we're then asking them to fix. And this form of economic central planning obviously emphasizes the role of the macroeconomics, and that this suffers from the same problem as market socialism, in just that it aggregates human action, removes the role of the individual, and instead what we need to do is have a method of economic analysis that starts with the individual and recognizes that he is a being made in the image of a creator who's granted him sub-creative powers that he's supposed to then take into the world and enact there. And instead we're treating human beings as so many automatons that can just be mathematically mapped.
Yep, unfortunately so. And I'm glad to hear your C.S. Lewis coming through the abolition of man there.
Oh yeah,
That hideous
yes,
strength. No, I think that's most important, and your work is vital in wrestling with some of those issues. I was actually just listening today to Russell Brand and Tucker Carlson talking about some of the same things at that popular level. So, regardless of what you might think about Russell Brand or accusations against him and things like that, I think that's amazing that he's able to share those things. And Tucker Carlson, likewise, who's also in a bit of hot water at the moment for some of his guests. But
yes.
it's great to have those talking points outside that allowable opinion, as you talked about. And that reminded me of Tom Woods, who uses it a
Yes.
little bit. That it's great.
Yeah,
How,
it's
sorry, George.
oh, it was fun discovering that the shared interests that you and I had on some of these topics that I were not obviously apparent
Mm,
with some of the topics that you had discussed, where it's not necessarily relevant. So it was fun to see how much overlap there was between our thinking.
mm. Excellent. Thanks, George. And in somewhat similar to the previous question, I'm curious how you view the art of history and its ultimate importance, I suppose, in contrast to the chronological snobbery, if I might channel Lewis again, which many folks today have. And again, there's this overly simplistic kind of pseudoscience of theories of history, whether that's Marxian or whatever. I wonder if you might speak to that.
Yeah. Yes. One of the problems that we routinely bump into whenever we're discussing something like history is that desire to simplify it and reduce it down to a single, easy to describe. Thinking again about the 3x5 card, something that we can easily put on a 3x5 card to understand causation and causality. And we're like, okay, now that I understand it, I can memorize it, and I could be done with the 3x5 card. Like, oh, how convenient is that? And that's a human desire to have a simplistic narrative that makes it easy for us to be able to operate and function in the world. And that's particularly easy to fall prey to with history, because we want to be able to use the past as a tool for the present. Obviously, like you had mentioned, Marxism, and right, that's the combination then of history and economics. Here we have this historical theory about how history functions. We have this economic model, and these two things are combined. Now, how then ought we to live? And we have this problem then where with history, where we're walking backwards into the future, because unlike walking down the physical road, we can only see the path behind us in history, and we don't know the future. The future is unknown. So we advocate for certain kinds of action, either that's political or economic, or sometimes social or moral, based on how we interpret historical causation of other events. And whether we're looking back at World War II, or we're looking back at the American War for Independence, we're looking back at the Reformation. So one of the problems that we're continually bumping into when people are trying to understand how do I approach history and are doing so poorly, we often see people saying, that event in the past is like this one in the present. So therefore, do X, Y, and Z. And so often this then incorrectly assumes that they are in fact like each other. And then furthermore, it assumes that we correctly understand the original event and what brought it about. And these are two very big assumptions that oftentimes are not fair to make, especially when you look at our very, very simplistic 3x5 card understanding of history and historical events. And frequently what actually happens is that the things we think are solutions, I was mentioning this with economics, they're in fact the cause of the problem to begin with. And that's particularly when we have situations where government intervention is involved, and politically or economically. And then also frequently the narratives that we inherit from the past about a past event. So I was thinking of something like the War of 1812 here in the United States, with between the United States and Britain. And we have a narrative, both Canadians and Americans have this narrative about, oh yes, we have the United States and we have Canada, and we have these two nation states with these two nation state identities at war with one another. But that nation state identity really emerged as a product of the war. Or at least the war had a very profound influence in helping to craft and create that image. And then what happens is immediately after the war, people then take that narrative and this identity as either Canadian or American, and they feed that back into the conflict and retroactively impose their present onto the past and say, the war was between this Canadian identity and this American identity, when in fact the war helped to contribute to its formation rather than being caused by those two identities. And we do that all the time then, where we're reading the past back into the present to try to help make sense of it. And so that's a continual problem that we have with history. And there's not really any way around that, like I said, because we can't see the future. So the past is the thing that we have to keep referring back to.
No, that's important. And it reminded me, there's a quote in David Cayley's A History of Secularism, where one of the guys talks about how they mentioned Swedish cavemen, obviously so long before the modern nation of Sweden existed, and that was in their museum in Stockholm or wherever. Thought that was hilarious. Swedish
Well,
cavemen.
yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, we always see those debates with things like with Cheddar Man, if you're familiar with that.
No, actually.
Oh, yeah, we find this body of this ancient individual who was living in England, what is modern day England, and we're trying to understand, well, how do we relate him to the present day inhabitants? And not too far from where I am in Idaho, we had a similar problem with the body of an individual that has now been termed Kennewick Man. And we're like, okay, well, what do we do with him? How does he relate to the people around this particular geographical location today? He's obviously very, very, very ancient. And how much of a identity can we draw from him to the present inhabitants? And it's not always obvious. So yeah, how do we relate these things?
And that's something about your work that I admire, that it's not just a black pill, so to speak, because you do deconstruct some popular myths and American forms of idolatry, not just exclusively American, but because your focus is often American history, certain forms of idolatry, we might say, if we're being honest. And I wonder, in line with that, I'm curious, this is very, maybe you don't have to answer this question, it's very specific to something I've been mentioning a lot. I've been giving out about the hermeneutic of suspicion a lot, and how Marxists will say, oh, it's all just about economics, or, in a simple form, or Nietzschean sort of, it's all about the will to power, and behind it there's a secret truth that only we can access, or whatever, this kind of neo-Gnostic tendency. But your work's not doing that. It is pointing to the machinations that are going on behind the scenes, and things aren't always as rosy, but it's in service of the truth as far as I can see, and for us to live better lives as flourishing human beings, for the glory of God and so on. So I wonder if you might speak to that, and maybe in contrast that overwrought hermeneutic of suspicion, what does a healthy Christian hermeneutic of suspicion look like, so to speak?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Um, yeah, particularly when I had mentioned earlier about the yeah, us wanting to have a very simplistic 3x5 card narrative. And yeah, and so often that takes the form, like with Marxism, of a very reductionist monocausal narrative. And that's never a right or appropriate way to see causation in history. And my students always joke that my tagline is "it's complex," which can sound like a cop-out answer, but I think it's one that speaks to the need for humility when approaching history. I think that's something that's vital. And uh, again, because of that problem of us walking backwards into the future, and that then causing us to want to use the history oftentimes as a bludgeoning tool for how certain policies ought to be implemented, or how society as a whole ought to be changed or affected by the history of the past. One of the problems that we have, though, is that there's a separation between us and history. And I had mentioned, I talked about this in a class recently, that if you have your two kids come in, and one of them complaining that while they were in the other room, one of them hit the other one on purpose. And it's like, okay, to what extent, since I wasn't present, I wasn't capable of witnessing this interaction, to what extent am I ever able to actually know what happened? And there's this, we could go the route of saying, well, we could never know, we can have no certainty, no actual knowledge about events that are beyond our personal experience. And that seems inadequate at some level. Like, okay, that doesn't seem to actually reflect our ability to interact with reality. And that's definitely not what we would do if we're good parents and we had our children in, and one of them was like, oh, my brother hit me on purpose here. We wouldn't just say, well, who could say? And there would be the first thing that we would do before jumping to any conclusions would be to say, all right, let's hear both sides. So I'm going to try to ask both of them, explain and tell me what occurred, and then take both of those narratives together to try to form an opinion. And then, based off of my knowledge of the history of these two individuals, thinking about the discussion in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with, do we know that, how do we approach Lucy's description about entering into a wardrobe and seeing some fantastical land in there? Well, we do so based off of our historical knowledge of her as a human being. So we have to implement that as well here. Are one of these children known to be liars? Is one of them known to be aggressive? And based off of that information, that then will help feed into my attempt to understand and make sense of what's going on with this event. And however, if we take that narrative, as we're trying to get to a closer and closer approximation of truth and understanding, again, one that starts off with a humility that, okay, I cannot know for certain, but I can start to approximate the truth as I'm taking their historical narrative that I understand about each one of these children, and then their description of the events that occurred in conversation with one another. If we complicate that, though, and say at the same time, and this is where it also gets especially tricky when discussing history, what if instead of them both being my children, one of them is my child? So now I don't just have the interactions of these two children and my attempt to make sense of their relationship to one another, but I also have to factor in, oh, I'm the parent of one. What's my bias? And how is my attempt to negotiate this situation affected by my relationship to this other parent, or to the fact that one of these children is not mine? And we can either respond by having a parent that's just like, well, my kid never did any wrong, my country, right or wrong. And you're just like, well, that's obviously not helpful. Or I could say, oh, well, I'm going to clearly side with the other child, my child. I don't want to be biased by this. And I'm like, well, that's not helpful either. So there's a certain bias that I personally have that also has to be taken into this situation. And that particularly becomes an issue whenever we're talking about historical narratives that we identify with. And that's one of the things that's really fun for me as an American teaching American history, that brings a certain level of complexity to the topic, because I'm not teaching Latvian history or Lithuanian history to a bunch of Americans.
Mhm.
Right? We don't have as much of a dog in the fight. And so so our study of history, it's even more complicated than just simply us walking backwards into the future and trying to use that in policy, but also we have a certain identification with certain narratives of the past, sorry. And we exist, and this is where it gets especially tricky. We exist in this cyclical relationship of narratival meaning making, where we derive meaning from our individual experiences, right? Our personal history that we've personally witnessed and participated in. So I have a mental autobiography about who I am as a human being based off of my own experiences over the course of my life. And that's informed who I am as an individual. But then at the same time, we outsource our meaning, right, to the community.
Mhm.
And we ask them to verify, is my autobiography that I find so meaningful that this is who I am as a human being, is it actually meaningful? Please verify. Please give me feedback. Tell me, yes, these are goals that I ought to be pursuing. And so then, and then we have communities that we self-identify with. And then those communities in turn have communal narratives, right? Whether that's me in the inland Northwest, me as an Idahoan, me as someone in the United States, or even North America. So we have these Russian nesting dolls of narratives, and we self-identify with these. And these communities in turn then, like I said, so they have communal narratives, and those narratives are both contemporary, right? There's a narrative that my country has right now about who they are and where we're going, but we have also a historical narrative, which I've never personally witnessed. And I was not around for the American Civil War or the American War for Independence. And interestingly enough, a lot of my ancestors weren't even here for that.
Mhm.
And yet that communal narrative provides my narrative, my individual narrative, with meaning. So we self-identify with these communities and as an extension of ourselves. And then we take the narratives that the community has selected for their meaningfulness. They're saying, okay, this is a meaningful communal narrative. And we use those to impart meaning to our own individual narratives. And then at the same time, we project the meaning that I've derived from my own personal experience onto the communal narrative. And I understand what's going on at the nation state level or at the more local community based off of what I personally have witnessed. So we exist in this cyclical loop where we're in response to the events in our lives, those of the community, and we shape and we reshape back and forth between our individual and communal narratives for the rest of our lives based off of events that occur. And hopefully we do that towards sainthood.
Mhm.
But, you know, hopefully that's where we're going. But we see so many people that end up going with narratives that are self-destructive and actually turn them away from where they ought to be going in the eternal. And so I think perhaps one of the most important things that we can do in this process is to become self-aware. Self-aware of our humanity, self-aware of our involvement and interaction with this process, so that we can better ask what narratives ought we to be deriving meaning from. And like you were saying, could question some of the popular narratives that the communities find meaningful and say, hey, this actually isn't a good narrative. And I think that, we look around the world today and ask, where are we going and why are we in this handbasket?
Mhm.
And it's like, we seem to have fallen prey to very bad and dangerous narratives that are leading us in directions that we as individuals and as communities don't want to go. But then in the midst of all this, like you're asking about, we as Christians, what's our relationship? What's our role with this? Like I said, we want to select narratives that can give us meaning, that orients us towards the eternal. And one of the things that I think having a proper understanding of history then does is that there are things that we can change as individuals, right? Namely ourselves. And there are people that we personally know because we've taken the time to build meaningful relationships with them so that we can then speak into their lives. Those are the things that we can change. And then there are the things that we personally can't change, right? Despite what the media tells us regarding national, state politics, global climate. But these are the things that they want to distract us by. And I'm reminded of a quote from the Metropolitan of Kiev. He said, politicians want us to forget about eternity and salvation of our souls. They want us to be always preoccupied with endless political squabbles. And then thinking, then from that, I remember there was a discussion between Martin Shaw and Paul Kingsnorth where, and I think it was Martin Shaw said that the best thing that we can do is to work to become saints. That's an individual responsibility. So a proper reading of modern history helps to establish that the problem is way too big for us individuals, that these narratives that the political state so often wants us to find as meaningful actually aren't. They don't provide meaning. Mm-hmm. And that they're trying to distract, that these narratives distract us by trying to orient us towards problem solving, or a better way of putting it is orienting us towards trying to save the world, which, and again, I think there's Paul Kingsnorth, I think it was, who said that important realization here is that I can't save the world, and that the world already has been saved. And that a proper understanding of modern history and the causation and the massiveness of these events and how long they are in the making, the complexity involved, means that they transcend my ability to change them, and they also transcend election cycles. So the emphasis that we place on, we'll just vote harder for the next guy. And you're like, no, it took us 150 years to get here. We're not getting out of it in 4. Mm-hmm. And this distraction is part of, it's not accidental. And that while they're being sold to us as meaningful, they actually aren't, and we can't derive meaning from them. It'll put us into an endless hamster wheel that's going nowhere in an attempt to save the planet, to save the world. And I said, where that's way too big for us. We can't possibly do that. So having a broad understanding of history, a broad reading of history, and seeing the complexity of events puts us as individuals within a very humble framework, such that I remember there was several years ago, there were events going down in Venezuela, and people were talking about the Venezuelan government attacking relief columns. And somebody asked me what I thought about the situation, and I was like, well, I don't know what's going on. And based off of my understanding of how history has functioned, or how the government has been involved with situations like the one that was unfolding in Venezuela, like there's a good possibility that regardless of how hard I attempted to understand what was occurring there, I possibly could never know what actually was happening, what actually was transpiring. But based off of what I have seen, thinking again about the children who are coming forward, and one of them says, oh, my sibling hit me. It's like, well, what do I know to be true about these people based off of past events? And that can lead to a certain gut reaction of suspicion then that I think is helpful about the political narrative that you have from people who are coming forward and saying, I can tell you what's going on. And you say, hang on, wait a minute. You have a dog in this fight. Why we're bringing out this former 4-star general who's now in the employ of Northrop Grumman, and we're expected to take his analysis of this situation seriously based off of his track record. Why would I do that? So and I think they're a healthy suspicion of the narrative that's being fed and sold to us, which, like I said, is also being designed towards something that doesn't actually properly orient us as Christians towards the eternal. We should immediately, I think, react to that with a certain air of suspicion and say, well, if you've been shown to be a liar based off of your own testimony historically again and again and again and again, why wouldn't I would be foolish to not treat that with a certain level of suspicion.
No, that's very helpful, George. And I think there's an element of that I was thinking about there the other day, how a lot of these people do have a materialistic worldview. So it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They believe that it's all about money and so on. So then their actions reflect that, and then we can judge them by that fruit. But
Yes.
having an integrated Christian worldview doesn't necessitate that. So yeah, I think that's a helpful distinction. And what you also said about narrative and the way you structured what you're describing there in terms of the kind of fractal pattern, I think is
Yes.
helpful, and Jonathan Bajot has helped me in that respect. And again, whilst I wouldn't want to make overly simplistic model of symbolic thinking, so to speak, that is a heuristic that is multi-layered that I think is superior to the way that many people are thinking. And Jordan Peterson, likewise, who you mentioned, is actually, I think, helping us with these little heuristics. They're helping Christians to think more clearly, more integrated manner, and so on. And you can see that in folks like yourself, even as it pertains to these important political questions and how we live as quasi-political beings, so to speak. So it's not just intellectual, it's about actually forming communities and so on. And I think that's why folks should take your work seriously, to be honest with you. And it also brings me to another element that I wanted to discuss with you. Being Christians and having that, so if I might borrow from Pajo, that's our identity in Christ is our central identity, so to speak. And then we can have these other identities coming out from that in little concentric circles and so on. And we have Chesterton's democracy of the dead and that sort of thing, going back and forwards in time. But so many Christians, unfortunately, it seems, in the States and elsewhere, but let's look at the American example for now. Many Christians think that they have to go back, so to speak, to this holy writ of the US Constitution, and they have these rosy views of the American founding and so on. And I think, oh, the world's gone to hell. But if we return to the founders, then it'll be fine. I wonder if you might speak to some of the limitations with that from a Christian perspective, and then maybe even borrowing from Thomas Sowell. We can maybe as Christians compared to what, so to speak. So maybe compared to other states and forms of political governance, and so on. The U.S. founders were better, but obviously not the kingdom of God and so on, as you mentioned in your work. Would you like to speak to that, and maybe even some of the themes that you've shared with the George Buchanan Forum, like these ununited states, national myth, and political reality in the American founding?
Yes, yeah, and this goes back to that question of that problem of walking backwards into the future and using the past then as a bludgeoning tool for how we then ought to think and act socially and politically. Again, so many of these problems erupt from or emerge from us trying to deal with questions that I think are too big for our humanity. or saying, man, if we could just get somebody in charge, or if we could just get back to this particular, if society as a whole could just get back to this particular period, then things would be right. So therefore, let's institute the following policies in order to try to make that happen. And I had mentioned earlier about the problem with saying, oh, this event in the past is like the event now, so therefore this is how then we ought to act. And that so often that assumes, okay, a certain knowledge about that past event that is oftentimes not accurate. And you're mentioning about America's political founding, or the founding of the United States. That's a particularly egregious one. And again, it's hardly surprising or shocking. This is the mythic ground that we were formed in for this communal narrative. Right? This is the primordial ooze of American politics from which we've emerged, and so because of that, right, we identify very, very strongly with these narratives, and it's an American myth. And I don't mean that obviously in the simplistic term of it being false, but this is our Genesis story. And so it has that symbolic resonance of an Edenic world. It has a fall. It has all of those traditional tropes and images that you would expect from such a narrative. And at some level, that's kind of inevitable, I think, for the way communities form. But it means then that when we attempt to understand, or when people, I think, use history as a tool for the future, it leads to all sorts of problems here, because then there's a term it's popular called founders chic. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It refers obviously to the American political system and towards the founding generation, our founding fathers. These are the men that birthed us. Right? So we have these founders, these founding fathers, right? These are our parents. And the general idea that this myth relies on is that we have these fathers that have come together, and in response to the depredations and tyranny of Great Britain, they have freed themselves from that. There's a certain Moses leading the children in this exodus from Egypt into this new world, into this promised land, and then defeating the forces of Pharaoh and establishing a new Jerusalem. Right? We have our Deuteronomical text, which is the Constitution, which has been it's God breathed. And you hear Americans actually use that language to refer to it, and it's so problematic on so many levels, both theologically and when we actually look at the history, because it assumes that there's this sort of almost a hive mind that existed from the founding fathers, that they sat down and I don't mean this to sound pejorative towards them or to belittle their intelligence, because I fully grant and appreciate the massive undertaking that they were involved in trying to actually separate from a country and then not have that fall apart. And you see how frequently that has gone poorly. And even think about the difficulties faced in things like the Irish War for Independence more recently. And it's like, okay, now that we've achieved some sort of level of independence or autonomy, what now? And the founding generation had a massive undertaking, a massive task on their hands. And the general approach towards what occurred there within the American myth is that they sat down and they created and crafted a document that reflected what they thought would be the best form of government in some sort of ontological sense. Like, this is the best form of human governance that all human governments ought to be or ought to aspire towards. And the truth of the matter is, it's not only far more complex, but it could be seen as disappointing when you look back and you realize, good golly, these people were human. And how much they disliked each other, how much they had a massive divisions between them, not just as individuals or even politically, but also within their local cultures. And this idea of, in 1776, a single American identity emerged as simply, it simply does not reflect reality at the time. You see people trying to create a national identity, people pushing for a national identity, but that's because one doesn't exist. And you have these localisms, you have these regionalisms that have their own interests and are combating one another. And that is true in 1776. And that's true because it existed long before there was any separation with Britain. And then after America declares independence from Britain, the war is concluded, those regionalisms, those localisms, these cultural distinctives don't evaporate, and immediately they fall back into infighting. And so the concerns that they have moving forward is that if there is a greater centralization, if we move from a disunity towards a unity, what we're not going to have is a government that reflects equally everybody's interests, but that we're going to have one of these regions, one of these parties dominating all of the others. And it'll be a form of imperial colonialism then at some point, which, right, that was the whole complaint with the war. And they're like, well, okay, have we traded a King George in England for a King George in Virginia? And how is that better? How has that solved the situation? How is that how is that an improvement? And for many Americans, immediately after the Constitution was written, it was seen as, like, okay, this is not actually better. And there was this huge wave of late loyalists, people that had actually fought in the American War for Independence on the side of independence, that actually left America and moved to Upper Canada into the Ontario region, so that actually the vast majority of the inhabitants in the Ontario area were what is now Ontario were actually recent immigrants from America. And like I said, people who were not loyalists back in the war. And it wasn't because they suddenly necessarily changed their political philosophy or their political theory from republicanism towards monarchy, but because they were responding to the actual situation that was going on in America with its unification and saying, this is not an improvement. I could get a better deal over in Upper Canada, because the King George at this point, in response to losing the American colonies, saying, how do we prevent that from spreading? And how can we try to bring the former American colonies back into the imperial fold? Well, what we'll do is we'll create sort of the anti-republic up in Canada. We'll give you free land. We'll give you, there'll be very little government intervention into your lives, so you won't have to worry about that. Basically, the things that the Americans were, that Englishmen living in the colonies were wanting in 1776. Like, we'll give you that in Canada. And what you do in return is you'll swear allegiance to the crown, and you won't have any actual representation in local government, in the Canadian government. So the government will leave you alone, and you will leave the government alone, but you'll have land. And for a lot of Americans, they thought this is actually a better deal than being colonized by business elites who were seen as taking over the political structure of government that had been formed in the wake of independence, and using that to solidify their power at the expense of, like I said, regional and local identities. And also, there was a distinction between people who otherwise who had been impoverished through the war, or perhaps were not as well off, and like I said, business elites that had done quite well for themselves and were more highly represented in the government. So when the Constitution then is formed, those business elites are largely the people that are involved in the formation of this new government. And rather than even coming together and trying to form this perfect government that all governments ought to aspire to. There was an attempt to create that by Madison with the Virginia plan, but the internal squabbles meant that instead what they achieved was a compromised document that honestly no one was satisfied. Neither the original people who were pushing for stronger nationalization and unification, or for the people that were wanting a stronger decentralization. And the delegates that walked away from the convention were thoroughly unimpressed with it. But you would have people that would push for accepting the document because they said either, in the case of Alexander Hamilton, it's a stepping stone towards what I think we ought to have, or people thought that it was better than the alternative, which was the loose confederation. And plenty of people disagreed. And like I said, there was a mass migration in the 1790s to try to get away from that. And that then also then feeds into the War of 1812. So the idea of trying to go back to this golden age and to this, like I said, this Mosaic law code that we all ought to be aspiring to just doesn't reflect the reality of the situation, and definitely doesn't reflect what they themselves thought at the time. But it was in their interest, the people who were pushing for unification, to try to sell it as this great law code that will help to bring about unity and a new nation, and something that will then give us hope for the future, and something that we can then use to then move forward into towards a national identity. So yeah, so using these, like I said, as bludgeoning tools and as golden age myths is of dubious usefulness, and it also doesn't do justice to, I think, the complex humanity of the people who were involved in these situations. And that's the thing. Those are the things that I really appreciate and enjoy digging into and drawing out with things like the George Buchanan Forum.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think I want to point folks also to your politics as usual, the making of the US Constitution. You talk about the US Constitution reflecting not just the founders' good intentions, but quoting Benjamin Franklin, their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. I think that's great. Another element that I wanted to discuss, somewhat similar to what we mentioned before in contrasting your work with, or contrasting it with the hermeneutic of suspicion, is in some sense we might call it revisionist. I don't know if that's the right term to use or not. But how does your reading and rereading of US history compare and contrast with those like the 1619 project, so to speak? And what are some of the major limitations of it and more modern rereadings and misreadings of US history, you might say?
Yeah, and I think things like the 1619 project, I think they're very much a result of the meaning crisis that we have, and the realization that these American myths aren't standing up. They're not performing the functions that we need them to perform to derive meaning from the community and to my life. And like I said, in this cyclical relationship that we have. And so as we're floundering around trying to find new narratives that could perhaps speak into our contemporary issues, we've found things like Marxism, and I had mentioned before the problem of monocausal reductionism. Again, the idea of like, okay, can we reduce something down to just a single cause? And once I understand that cause, then that will explain all of the human decision making and why they did what they did within that time period. And that's just not helpful, or that's not a manner in which we should ever approach history. And Marxism obviously approaches history from a very material, causal perspective that sees everything within the class conflict, or at least the original Marxist understanding of history. And the 1619 project then saying, okay, we have something like the narrative of this golden era that I just described. That's not working anymore. It doesn't hold up for us either with our analysis of the past or with what we need the past to do for us in the present. So how do we find a new narrative? And the 1619 project saying kind of, okay, let's, instead of talking about this golden era that we need to go back to, the emphasis then is on that first moment of biting the fruit, where sin then enters into our our world. It kind of does away with there being an Eden at all. There was only the sin. In the beginning, man ate the fruit. And says, okay, slavery. All right. And that's the founding moment. And this is the thing that gives our identity as Americans meaning. And, obviously we end up bumping into problems of reductionism, but not least because the 1619 project is complicated, because it's also responding, like I said, to problems with our analysis of the history, and saying, okay, with Marxists in the early 20th century, there was an attempt to understand what was our economic relationship towards slavery as a country. And there was this sense that, looking at the numbers, looking at the data, they're like, okay, slavery is not profitable. Like there's economic problems with slavery compared to wage labor. Like a country that is built off of wage labor rather than slavery is going to be a more profitable country, economically speaking. So what was it then that slaveholders were interested in? What were they trying to pursue by maintaining slavery? And so there was a strong sense between both the Marxists and also a certain level of Southern agrarianism that began to emerge throughout that time period, that said, well, the South was this agrarian community that was pre-industrial, because they emphasized more feudal relationship that was more humane, that the master-slave relationship was one of benevolence, beneficence, and that it was symbiotic at some level, and that would help to explain why they would pursue something that seemed to be so economically inefficient. And the 1619 project is responding to that, and very correctly saying, actually, as we're looking at the data and we're looking at the rise of the planter class in the southern United States, these people actually found slavery very profitable. They were businessmen. They were very interested in the dollar and cents of slavery. And these individuals used slavery as not just a means towards personal individual wealth, but also political power within their own southern economy and southern political system. And we had the formation of a planter class built off of slavery, and that these people, like I said, they were businessmen. They're interested in the dollar and cents of slavery, but they're also very progressive. They see themselves on the cutting edge of science. They have scientific explanations for why slavery is right, good, and beneficial, and why it's why not only should Africans be put into slavery, but hey, it's good for other people. They're having a very Aristotelian sense of, well, some people actually are designed in some sense for slavery. And this is very scientific. We're seeing ourselves, as I had mentioned earlier, on the cutting edge of progressivism here, and that the future actually is slave labor. We're in competition here with British wage labor that's going on, particularly with places like India, or even with northern industrial wage labor there. And Southerners are saying that system is actually not as beneficial for the workers, and also it's, economically speaking, not as profitable. This was the claim that Southern planters are making. And so the 1619 project, taking that, is like, okay, the United States was built on slavery and profited economically from it. And the truth then ends up emerging kind of between these two, where yes, Southern slave owners were businessmen, were very interested in, like I said, the dollars and cents of slavery and its profitability, but slavery was being utilized by them at the expense of the Southern economy as a whole. And that it's actually not economically efficient. It has all sorts of inefficiencies, of dead weight loss that have to be countered by political intervention into the economy, by subsidization. And so in some sense, the political planter class was utilizing an outmoded, an inefficient method for economic wealth, but it worked for them because they were able to do so through political support. And that's what's so the 1619 Project is correct that yes, these people are businessmen. Yes, they are trying to push for the expansion of slavery. Slavery was not dying. It's not going away on the eve of the Civil War, so long as it has government subsidization and protection. But that's what's necessary in order to actually make it work. So the United States, economically speaking, then is not built on slavery because it was in that sense profitable only for a very small minority of people. So, and yeah, and those people again, there's so much that's problematic with the people like Eugene Genovese's works through like Roll Jordan Roll, which again that's a fantastic work of research and for its time, but has become greatly its usefulness has become greatly reduced as we see just actually how motivated Southern planters were by profits. And I think in that sense, the 1619 Project is actually helpful. But so it's a mixed bag. And the way people want to use it then for political ends today is where it becomes especially problematic and an issue. So hopefully that answered your question.
No, that's great. Thanks, George. And you go into that in more detail in Southern slavery and Confederate socialism. And it's interesting also when you look at some of these issues today, beyond that black and white, a crude good and evil picture that we have, oh, we're on the right side of history and so on. I don't know, maybe I'm off here, but it seems that in some ways, the way you have to deperson someone with things like abortion nowadays is very similar to the way they had to deperson the slaves, and they thought they were the good guys, as you mentioned. The eugenicists, even in the 20th century, were you had some of the intellectuals, kind of Anglo-Irish intellectuals in Ireland,
Yeah.
were calling for eugenics, all this kind of stuff. But they're the good guys. They're the right side of
Yeah.
history. It's fascinating. Even today, I think I heard it on maybe it was in X/Twitter about the American basketball player Steph Curry was siding with Kamala Harris because he wanted to protect women's rights, aka abortion, and this was his way of justifying Kamala Harris presidency on. But oh my gosh.
Yeah. No, I think you're onto something there for sure. And the connections between, yeah, that dehumanization that's involved. And yeah, some of the writings from the time in that dehumanization process is as the defense of slavery evolves, as it's trying to respond to new political threats, becomes really shocking as time goes on. And and yeah, to where they're saying, well, it's a necessary evil, to where no, it's right, good, and proper that people be enslaved and that certain classes be enslaved, certain races be enslaved, and yeah, having a stronger justification for that built around race or class even. So yeah, it becomes very dehumanizing very quickly.
And even Christians, unfortunately, obviously justified it in their own perverse way. I think that was one thing that really struck me about the Museum of the Bible. Whenever I was in
Mm.
Washington, D.C., they had on one side the Bible being used for slavery, and the other side against slavery, and it just brought to my mind Yvonne Illich and how he talks about the corruption of the best being the worst. Even God's holy word, they can bring down and twist it to try and justify such evil. So as Christians, we're not going to make an idol in that respect. We could admit that Christians do misread the Bible, but the big picture of the Christian story and Christ himself calls us away from that. Whereas I think, unfortunately, in some of these other worldviews and so on, you don't have that corrective mechanism, so to speak. Obviously, Christ's more than that, but Christ called out the Pharisaical elements in Christianity and so on. Whereas you don't have that in Marxism or those other worldviews, as far as I could see. You
Yeah.
determined, your little cog in the machine, you're an avatar for your class interests, or the neo-Marxist kind of way of reading history, you're an avatar of your white interests and so on. They'll use color characteristics and things like that instead of the old bourgeoisie and proletariat, but you still have that same basic conflict structure, black and white view of history, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mentioned that earlier also with just that economic approach. We're just seeing humanity in the aggregate as just so much dollars and cents and resources being moved about, the pea under the cup. And it's just our ability to reduce our humanity to that so that we can then track the movement around economically speaking that's just another form of that dehumanization that's occurring that you're describing.
Lord have mercy.
Yeah, it's all part of the machine, right? That's
King's
that's yeah, it's creating us to either be it's producing people who will either or simultaneously be used to collect data or be collected for their data, and that's what it wants us to become.
It's a nice, happy thought. I want to tell my viewers or listeners where they could find out more about you and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, fantastic. So the George Buchanan Forum stuff, you can see that. You can find that either any podcast app or on YouTube. You can also find it at tgbf.org. So that's the main website. I'm on Twitter at GE Harrell. And then also the courses that I teach, they're available through Kepler Education. So you can look that up and see any of the high school things that I'm plugging away there and the courses that I'm having fun with when the school is in. So yeah, and if people find the material that we're producing through George Buchanan Forum to be helpful, I would love to see more interaction around that, and also things that people might find helpful or interesting topic wise. So
That's great. Thank
yeah,
you,
I would definitely
George.
encourage that.
I most appreciate your time and I look forward to part two, and God bless you in your work.
Thank you so much, and the same to you. This has been a real blessing.